Water fell through the holes in the ceiling, splattering heavily into the swollen, saturated carpets. The young girl moved slowly through the room, filthy dampness seeping up around her small trainers. She could feel it leaking through her shoes and into her socks. Graffiti lined the walls of the house, some of it childish scrawling, some of it quite artful. Some the girl understood, some she didn't. Much of it vulgar. She paused in front of a chipped wall, dominated by the clumsily spray-painted words, "The devil is here and wants to take you away." Even as an 8-year-old, she sniffed dismissively at the spelling. She walked carefully up the stairs. The ceiling here was intact, so the floorboards far more stable. But she still moved with caution. There were lots of exposed nails poking through the woodwork. At the top of the stairs was a small round window, one of the few in the house with the glass still intact. She had to stand on tiptoes to see out. The surface was dirty. She looked out at the flat blankness of the fen landscape, empty, gray countryside scarred with drainage ditches and odd-angled trees, increasingly hidden by dark, encroaching drizzle. The car was down below, parked in front of the house. The girl's mother was still sitting in the driver's seat, head thrown back, face torn away, jaw slack, and gaping, a mouth full of smashed, broken teeth. The inner windows were an explosion of already drying crimson. The girl peered down at her for a while before moving on, closer to the devastating holes in the roof. It was chillier up here, some of the rain falling down through the house, turning to spray in the strong drafts. She was only wearing her dungarees and a t-shirt, and held her arms for warmth. She headed towards a door so badly smashed it was hanging from one hinge only, splintered and shattered. She carefully slid past it into a room overlooking the overgrown garden. At the back of the house, with more featureless landscape beyond the crooked and broken fencing, her father, hands bound behind his back and an old rag stuffed and taped into his mouth, was here. He was on the wet, stinking carpet, rain soaking his clothes through. His hair was plastered to his face, almost hiding it. His ankles had been shattered badly, shocking gray bone piercing his leg on one side. Skin was yellow in pain. He lifted his head when he realized she was there. He looked exhausted and in agony, but tried to form words through the muffle of his gag. The girl watched him dispassionately, her arms hanging limply by her sides. One of her fingers rubbed idly at the stitching on her dungarees. He grunted desperately at her for a while, pleading and frantic, twisting his body as he tried to free his arms. Eventually realizing he was getting no response, he slowly looked at her with wide, bewildered eyes. She wrenched a shard of wood from the shattered door. It had a vicious, pointed end. Her palm began to bleed from gripping the sharp wooden edges. He tried talking again as she approached him, trying to make more words around his gag, trying to reason with her eyes. Then he began to scream into the fetid material, balled into his mouth. Crazily, hysterically trying to lunge his body away, eyes bulging at something over her shoulder. The girl could sense there was someone behind her. She knew her father wasn't screaming at her. She took him by the hair and cradled him in the denim against her chest. She stabbed him in the face. It made a dull, meaty sound, and he made a startled, straining grunt. She yanked the stake out and did it again and again, destroying his eyes and his face and his teeth and the meat that made up his personality and his soul, and wrecked his head until the wood was blunted and useless. Her hands were torn to ribbons, rough wooden pins jutting out of her torn soft skin. She paid them little notice at first. She let her father's head go, and his body slumped heavily against the wall. She dropped the stake to the soft floorboards. She turned to the figure behind her. The tall man stepped towards her. He wore an aging suit and a fraying, musty overcoat. His head was split down the center, the ancient wound creating two gray flaps of dried face. Eyes watched her at insectoid angles. She held her bleeding hands out, only now seeming to feel any pain, looking down in despair, her face grimacing into an imminent sob. He opened his arms for her. She embraced him. She was now feeling the pain at her shredded palms and torn fingers.
"Grandpa?"
She cried at the old man for comfort. A coworker told me this about 3 years ago. She said that I could share it, but only so long as I promised to protect her identity and remove identifying details. I'll do that now by referring to her only as M. This is the story M told me, as best as I can tell it to you. There was an older man in M's neighborhood who seemed very pleasant, in the way that elderly strangers often are. M owned a dog and the old man owned one too. He asked M one day whether she'd like to start walking their dogs together. They arranged to meet at his house around noon the next day. M arrived at the agreed-upon time and knocked on the door. The old man answered and explained that he wasn't quite ready to leave yet. He invited her in to sit down for a few minutes while she waited for him. She agreed and stepped into the house. Her dog, a terrier puppy, followed her inside and began sniffing around the man's ankles. The man invited M to sit, gesturing at an upholstered chair in a sunny corner of the living room. At this point, there didn't seem anything wrong. M sat down. Her first clue that things were wrong was when the man plopped a heavy hardcover book into her lap.
"I'll be ready in just a few minutes,"
he said.
"That book is worth looking through until then."
He smiled and lowered himself onto the nearby couch to lace his shoes, grinning up at her while he did so. He was waiting for her to open the book, and so she humored him. M doesn't remember the exact title, but it was clearly a collection of graphically erotic poetry. M was around 28 years old when this happened, and the man who had now cornered her in the house with a tome of old erotica was at least in his 60s. The man plied her with questions about her favorite kind of poems, while he dawdled with his shoelaces. M says she began to feel like she was being stalked by a predatory animal. Finally, the man seemed satisfied by her guarded answers to his questions.
"I just need to leash up Buster,"
he said.
"and then we can go."
He left her alone in the room. M put the book aside. She was feeling uncomfortable and prepared to leave the house regardless of whether her neighbor was ready or not. That's when she heard a woman scream. The voice that cried out was plainly coming from the basement, and it sounded to M like someone downstairs was being murdered. She heard the word shouted with so much force, the woman's voice was breaking. M couldn't immediately process what was happening. It seemed too absurd. Her terrier puppy froze in place upon hearing the scream, and then ran to her so that she could scoop him up in her arms. She rose from the chair to run for the front door, but the old man was suddenly standing behind her. He owned a much larger dog, and the hound was now leashed and ready at his hip. It bristled as though it was now very, very nervous.
Don't worry,
the old man laughed, as though nothing strange at all had happened.
That's my...
He paused and snapped his fingers as though searching for a word.
What do you call it? Yes, that's my parrot. I keep a parrot in the basement. It just screams like that sometimes. He's my pet. That's all it was.
Begged the voice from the basement. The man's smile grew wider and more cloying.
Let's go down to the basement,
he said.
I'll show you. It's just my parrot down there.
The old man was using his own body to try and move M down the stairs. He held the door to the basement open while blocking the hallway that led back to the front of the house. His large dog was bristling just behind him. M had only two choices. She could either agree to go down the stairs, or she could flee with her own dog directly backwards into the living room. M decided to flee backwards. She returned to the living room and started making excuses about why she needed to leave. The old man followed her into the living room, trying to calm her. She claimed that she was feeling sick and that her boyfriend would be expecting her back home soon. M didn't really have a boyfriend waiting for her at home, but the old man's face deflated when she said that she did. Taking advantage of his hesitation, she was able to push past him and make for the front door of the house. The man didn't chase after her. He just protested angrily that she was being silly. M threw the door open and let herself out. When she got home, she called the police and told them what she'd heard coming from the basement. They took her statement and said they'd look into it. M saw the old man's car disappear from his driveway about 2 hours after she left his house. The police arrived later that evening to investigate, but the man hadn't returned. Curious about what happened, M says she called a few days later to inquire whether the authorities found anything. "This is now an open investigation," they told her. "We can't give you those details."
Please, just tell me one thing,
M insisted.
Was there a parrot in the basement? A birdcage? Anything like that?
The voice on the other end of the line grumbled before answering.
No, ma'am. Nothing like that.
Back in 2016, I was working at a summer camp in western Pennsylvania. It was my third summer there, and by far my favorite. As a high schooler, spending months away from home in the woods was a dream come true, especially given that the months were spent working with kids or veterans, with the occasional interesting school group or corporate group. Most of my work was maintenance, logistics, or facilities, but occasionally I was put on as a counselor for a team with children. The days were long, but after we finished our duties, we were free to string up our hammocks and sleep anywhere we'd like around the camp, so long as we didn't disturb any groups. And it was late in the season, so by this night, myself and my two buddies were plenty comfortable with the area and decided to sleep at the edge of the furthest cabin loop. We triple-stacked our hammocks, one above the other on the same two trunks, and started the fire just before the daylight retreated from the trees. The edge of this loop was quite far away from the headquarters cabin and chow hall, so any light from the night shift lamps died out long before it reached us. The cabin we were by, a bit more dilapidated than the rest of our cabins, was on the outside edge of the trail, which represented the extent of our cabin before miles of forest. This section, in particular, has denser underbrush. The outside edge of the trail being lined by a wall of briars a couple yards thick and just over head height, almost like a hedge wall. The cabin's steps fell out onto the trail, and just across from that was a fire pit. Our triple stack was a few yards from the fire pit, still on the near side of the trail. We stayed up for a few hours and chatted about whatever popped into our high schooler brains. Body counts, the military, music. The campfire slowly died down as we talked, and as the flickering lights pulled back from the cabin and briar wall, to slink back into the embers of the pit, we decided to call it a night. We snapped a photo of ourselves in front of our stack and climbed up to sleep. As I lay there waiting to sleep, it occurred to me that the forest wasn't right. There were no nighttime bugs making their usual ambience. No frogs. Even the rustling of the leaves in the breeze was dampened. And the breeze, it was colder than any night previous and colder than any July ought to be. The lack of ambience seeped into me. Every pop from the low-glowing embers in the pit echoed amongst the trees and struck my nerves. I strained to hear anything, hoping for the crickets to come back. And then it started. Out past the briar wall, some kind of noise was heard, felt, bounding and reverberating across the trunks. Sounded almost like an axe hitting a tree, but too soft on the tail end. And at this time of night? And it's a bit fast for that. Steady, but no one could draw back an axe and strike again that fast. At least not with enough force to make such a solid noise. It's almost like it's growing louder, and almost in an exact set of 3. I opened my hammock and turned my head towards the outer edge of the trail, towards that noise. I could just make out a dim orange light in the woods past the briars. No, that's not growing louder. It's coming closer. I looked down to my friends and feebly asked if they heard the noise. The fear in their half-whispered yeses struck me through the frozen air. It couldn't have been more than 10 yards behind the briar wall now, and we all knew it. Without a word, we sprung from the hammocks, started stuffing everything in our day packs as fast as we could. It felt like we were packed in seconds and started running past the fire pit to head down the hill towards Camp Maine. It was just behind the briar wall now, but we were packed, ready to run. And yet, it felt like it was all I could hear. I suddenly felt a pull. I turned back towards the briars and I could see a dull orange glow seeping through the twisted limbs of the thicket now, and I just wanted to see. My friends could see my intention. One pleaded with me.
"We have to go now. What are you doing?"
I remember replying,
"If we don't look now, we'll never know. Just one look and we go."
I stepped towards the wall, and it felt so right. My second friend grabbed my shoulders, and as soon as he touched me, it felt like my head was swimming. Before I could reply or protest, he started pulling me down the path towards the main. I remember feeling warmer the closer we got towards the central camp. Admittedly, we ran the entire trail back, but it was like the forest thawed. The insect chatter came back first, then the frogs, then the leaves on the wind. The woods regained its usual inviting feel. We slept on the floor of the dining facility. Can't say why I suddenly felt so compelled and so sure that I needed to go past the briar wall and look that night. But what would have happened if my friends didn't stop me? All I know is that we stuck to Camp Maine for the rest of the season, and that when we looked in the morning, the photo we took had 3 dull orange orbs floating across the background. The setting ball of fire in the sky cast the most mesmerizing glow on the figure seated by the window. The sunlight caught her gray hair and made it shimmer. Even in her very old age, she still maintained her aura of youthful vibrance. Her wrinkled skin, cracking ever so slightly, seemed to glow in the magnificent dusk. Her arthritic hands clasped tightly in her lap, playing with a rosary. It was not merely a distraction, but a ritual. She prayed every day, morning to night, with a rosary ever ready in her hands. It was not just beads on a string, but a beacon to help her get prayers to God, she told James. Whether this was disillusions at her old age or merely a joke, James was not sure. But it made her happy, and therefore it brought him some sense of joy. He would sit and stare at his mother throughout the day. Broke his heart to see her so frail. She had always been fragile, but the death of her husband of 50-odd years had really taken a toll on her. When James had first heard of the passing of his father just over a year ago, he dropped his job as a columnist for the local paper and rushed home to be with Edith. Neither of them had taken the death very well. Who takes death well? And they had decided it was best they stay together during the tough times. After the funeral and cremation, they left the hustle and bustle of the city life and moved to their summer cabin on the lakeside, far away from the woes of town. It was not merely to get away from the city, but rather to spend their time in a place that brought them joy. The cabin was a yearly getaway for the whole family during school summer break, and they would spend the month fishing, canoeing, and playing board games. The tradition had continued well after school ended. It was their way of staying close to their father and husband. James cooked and cleaned for them both. It wasn't a huge cabin, so he had no problem, was managing just fine. He made weekly trips into town to collect groceries to feed them. Life was simple. The only problem was Edith. She just sat praying. She didn't seem to be healing or getting anything from their seclusion.
James, I've got something I would like to do.
This was the first time she had spoken in ages, besides the frequent thank you and nods when being addressed. What is it, Mum? What would you like? James asked her excitedly.
I'd like for us to talk to your father. I've prayed on it, and I feel him here with us. He just has no way of speaking.
James was unsure what exactly she meant. She looked at him hopefully and seemed to be waiting for an answer. Seeing how excited his normally quiet mother was, James asked what talking to his father would entail.
I've seen a few articles in the paper,
Edith said.
We'll get the lady in to be the mediator between us and your dad, and she'll help us talk to him.
James rolled his eyes and let out a groan of annoyance. His mother's face dropped, and he could see the bright flare in her eyes snuff out from his response. Not wanting to see his mother return to her comatose state, he told her they could indeed give this mediator a call. A week had passed since they had called the 800 number listed in the paper. His mother now sat at the window, phone in hand rather than the rosary. James was not usually an analytical person. However, his immediate thought on this was the sudden switch in his mother's belief from God to hope in the unknown. What this meant, he did not know. Later that day, when the blazing ball highlighted her gray wisps of hair, the phone came alive. It startled them both as they sat in silence. Edith merely stared at the phone, prompting James to take it and answer. He listened intently, nodding at what was said and thanked the unknown caller. His mother stared at him, too shocked or anxious to ask. "She's coming tonight, Ma," James informed Edith. The bright sunlight seared his eyelids. He mumbled while rambunctiously reaching up to cover his eyes. Why had he left the curtains open? Having adjusted relatively well, he managed to open his eyes at last. He looked up at the sofa, knew immediately it was not his bed. He'd woken up on the floor and had no idea why. His back clicked as he sat up. Hard floor is not an adult's best friend when a good night of sleep is in question. All lethargy and confusion immediately dispersed as his eyes stumbled upon his mother, who lay across from him on the living room floor. He rushed up and made his way to her. lifting her gently off the floor and setting her down on the couch. Panic set in at the thought she had fallen at night and had laid there unattended to. Her eyes shot open, and a huge smile washed over her face.
James!
She exclaimed.
I think it worked.
James was in awe. His mother was up and in the kitchen making them breakfast. She hadn't walked this much in years. Confused, he sought the newspaper to retrieve the number he had last called. After a few rings, a nervous-sounding voice answered. "Hi, is this Lady Gert?"
What do you want?
She asked before James finished the name. "I just wanted to ask what exactly happened last night. I must confess I don't remember much, but my mother seems to think something worked."
You must not call this number again. Your house is in no good spirit. I am sorry.
Lady Gertrude said before hanging up. Even more confused, James tried recalling the number. The automated voice on the other line informed him that the party was out of service. James inhaled deeply. He could smell bacon.
The number you have dialed is out of service. Please try calling the number again or dial 0 for assistance.
"Mom, what do you mean it worked? What worked?" James asked his mother.
I can feel your father, honey. It's almost as if he's sitting down to breakfast with us.
Edith said. "What? What happened last night?" was the next question out of James' mouth. His mother looked confused, deep in thought. She put her knife and fork down.
Well, what do you know, Jimmy? Your mom must be getting old. For the life of me, I can't remember.
She said with a laugh.
Eat your bacon before it gets cold.
James sat up in bed. It was just a nightmare. He pressed the home button on his phone to check the time. His phone was dead. Thankful for having woken up in his bed this time, he felt along the bedside table for the lamp. His watch was on the table, so he checked the time. It was dark out, but it might be close to 5 a.m., and if it was, he would just start the day an hour earlier than usual. Maybe he'd make Edith breakfast in bed today. He felt the bulge of the lamp bottom and fumbled for the switch. It clicked on and illuminated his room. He glanced at his watch. It was 4:47. Guess it was going to be an early start to the day. A shadow in the corner near the door caught his eye and startled a small shout of surprise from him.
What?
The figure of his mother stood, back to him, facing the wall. She probably took too many Imavants to help her sleep. Sometimes she would sleepwalk.
"Mom?"
James called out as he began to stand.
"Let's get you back to bed for a while. It's still early."
The popping sounds her neck made as it turned sounded like when you crack your knuckles. James stared as his mother's head turned a full 180 degrees to stare at him, while her body faced the front. She stood, facing the wall but looking at him. He felt goosebumps break out all over his body. His bladder let loose, and he felt the warm stream run down his legs.
"Sorry, Jimmy boy. Your mother doesn't seem to be here at the moment,"
said the head of his mother, with a voice that wasn't hers. Now, this isn't a scary story, but more of a creepy one. My friend's dad's family used to live in the woods near Eureka Springs, Arkansas. My friend's uncle was the oldest of the 3 kids and was allowed to explore the woods on his own, even though he was only about 9. One day, he came across a little cottage nestled in the woods. He knocked on the door. He was greeted by 2 old ladies. He promptly asked for some water, as he had been exploring for hours.
The ladies invited him in and gave him milk and cookies, and sat down and talked with him while he pet their white cat. They talked for a while. They eventually invited him to stay for dinner and spend the night, because it was getting dark, and he was a long way from home. His parents were pretty used to him being in the woods for nights without coming back, so he accepted without question. He spent the night without incident and returned home the next morning. He visited many more times over the next year, and one day they told him to bring his parents and brothers the next time he came. So the next week, the whole family embarked on a long trek to the cottage. When they arrived, however, they found the remains of a small cottage that appeared to have been abandoned for years. Everyone was very confused, as they all trusted that my friend's uncle had visited the women many times. They had absolutely no idea what had happened, or if my friend's uncle had actually been visiting anybody. To make things even weirder, as they were leaving, an old, skinny white cat ran past them, darting into the trees, leaving them in utter shock.
The circumstances in which we found Miss Carey were unpleasant. She'd been dead just over a week by the time we were called out, though how much of the smell came from her decomposing body, and how much from the house she had lived in, was difficult to determine. It was unclear how long she'd been sitting on that damn sofa, though the odd man she'd lived with thought that it might have been as much as 5 years. She had eventually become too large to get off of it. Nevertheless, it was long enough for her to have become part of the thing, with the sores on her legs and buttocks having opened and then closed around the material, woman and couch, one being for years on end until she died on it. Disturbingly, this wasn't the first time I or my fellow paramedics had seen something like this, but it certainly was the worst case. The look of the house, the smell of it, the sight of her skin, and the cloth of the couch merging together was such an overwhelming experience that, at first, none of us noticed her hair. It had grown long over the years, clumped strands of it trapped between her back and the cushions, and as we levered her off the sofa, it grew tight, pulling her head back, and it was only then that we realized that it, too, had worked its way in between the threads of the material. I assumed that it would come out with a good tug, but it was apparently worked well in. When we pulled on Miss Carey, the hair stayed put, and her scalp threatened to come away instead. In the end, I grabbed a pair of scissors from the kitchen and cut her loose. The rest of the call was no easier. The coroners didn't have a body bag to fit her. The trolley barely took her weight, and it took both of us and a few police officers that helped us get her into the van. The suspension fared little better, whilst my colleagues spoke to the officers, and they to Miss Carey's strange partner. There would be questions for him later about possible negligence as to why he had waited so long to notify us of her death. I wandered back into the living room to take another look at that grotesque sofa. There was now a large patch of missing material, where she had been sitting, exposing the stinking, discolored padding underneath. I shook my head, feeling a little disgusted, but more sad than anything else. Another tragic case. And then something caught my eye. I thought I saw something move within the cushion. I took a step closer and peered down. What was it? An insect? But all I could see was a tendril of hair lying across the padding. I hesitated, my eyes narrowing as I focused on the hair. Maybe it was a trick of the light, but it looked like it was moving, being pulled down into the cushion. A sudden hand on my arm made me cry out with alarm. I turned and was surprised to see Miss Carey's partner staring at me with wild eyes. "You can't take it!" he gasped. "Take what?" I said, thinking that he was probably referring to the body. I was about to gently explain that we had to, when instead he pointed at the couch behind me. "That! You can't take it! It's what I have left of her." To be honest, I had no idea whether he would get to keep the sofa or not. It seemed like a biohazard to me. "I'm sure somebody will be along to talk to you about it," I said, patting his hand reassuringly. He shook his head. "Oh, they can't have it. Not whilst she's still inside it." That was quite enough for me. I smiled at him and then made my excuses to return to the outside, where there was a little more fresh air and sanity. I wonder, though, if madness isn't a little catching. His words stayed with me, and the sight of that strange hair, moving or not, kept on coming back to me over the following days. I told my wife, who has endured many disturbing stories over the years, about the couch and the hair and the strange man. She hugged me and suggested that maybe this time I should actually go and speak to a counselor. I said I would, knowing I probably wouldn't, and I went to bed, where I slept badly and dreamt about hair. Over the following week, I tried to put it out of my mind and get on with my job, but through every call out, from simple accidents to serious injuries, I kept finding my attention drawn back to Miss Carey's couch, which was how I found myself standing outside of her house, telling myself that I was just being a good Samaritan. I was there to check on her partner. I was certainly not craving another look at that goddamn sofa. I knocked on the door and I waited. No response. I knocked again. Still nothing. A little concerned, but mostly impatient. I tried the door and found it unlocked. I probably didn't hesitate for as long as I should have before I went in. I called out, "Sir?" as I walked through the hallway. I could hear no sounds, and he wasn't to be seen in the kitchen ahead of me. If he's here, I thought, he'll probably be in the lounge. So I went straight in. The room looked exactly as I'd left it. It even smelled the same. There was the sofa, discolored and exposed. I felt my heart pounding in my chest as I walked up to it, and I looked down at the cushions. The hair that I'd seen before was gone. I peered closer, though I don't know what I expected to see. There was nothing there. And then I looked up at the part of the couch she would have rested on, where her back would have been pressed, her hair trapped between, and saw a pulse. It was a gentle movement, small enough to go unseen by someone not looking for it. As if in a daze, I reached out and poked it. Something like a shudder passed over the cushion. The scissors I had used to cut Miss Carey free were sitting on the coffee table. I picked them up and, with a mouth as dry as a bone, cut into the cushion. I snipped a line across, and then with my bare hands, I took hold of the material and ripped it open. The hair inside seemed to shrink away from the sudden light, but there was so much of it that it had nowhere to go. It was twisted into the threads of the cloth and buried deep into the padding, thickly matted. I could hear it. I could hear it as it moved against itself, against the material. I stared at it for a moment and then started making cuts in the other cushions, tearing at them to see inside. The hair was everywhere. But this was impossible. Even over that length of time, surely she couldn't have grown and lost so much hair. And how could it have worked its way so deeply inside the couch? My brain seemed to be trying to ignore the fact that it was moving. Suddenly, I felt something prick at my wrists, and I looked down. There was hair, but it wasn't mine, and it wasn't just lying on me. The end was against my skin, and I could see it twisting and moving as it tried to push its way inside. A small dot of blood appearing where it pressed against me. I cried out and I pulled it away. Part of the filament snapped off, but there was still a fragment left, wriggling desperately. Without hesitation, I snatched up the scissors again and sliced into myself, cutting away a layer of skin from the hair with it. My horror and fear easily overriding the pain. I flung them away from me and I stared at the couch in terror. And that was when, no longer blinded by my curiosity and compulsion, I saw a foot poking out from behind the sofa. My breath caught in my throat and I swallowed hard. Then I moved carefully forward, not getting too close, and I peered behind that wretched piece of furniture. To this day, I don't know the man's name, but there was the late Miss Carey's partner lying on the ground behind the couch, pressed against the back of it. Hair covered him nearly completely, wrapping around his body, growing into his skin. His eyes were open, hair boring into them even as he stared at me with terrified desperation. I took a step closer, but as if sensing that I'd found him, the hair tightened around his body, penetrating deeper into him, pulling him even closer against the sofa. I knew that it was too late for him, that there was nothing I could do to help at this point, even if I was brave enough to try. But I had to do something. A few days later, a colleague asked me if I'd heard of the fire at Miss Carey's house. Of course, I said that I hadn't, and I asked what had happened. No one was sure, he said. A real tragedy, as her partner had been found in the remains, burnt beyond recognition. Nothing much was left, but no surprise there. The place had been a fire hazard for years, and the flames had spread quickly, consumed everything. I asked about the couch. He chuckled. Totally gone, he confirmed. And good riddance, eh? I agreed, scratching my wrist. Maybe I'll try that counseling after all.
On the field where tradition is king, where coaches are legends, warriors will rise. With nothing left to lose.
Mick, can we do that one again?
What's the matter this time?
More inflection on the will rise part. A little dead, that last one.
Sure.
Okay, and rolling.
On the field where tradition is king, where coaches are legends, warriors will rise. With nothing left to lose, Rick Danning has a chance to discover.
Mick?
Oh, for fuck. What part now?
Can you add more intensity to the has a chance part? Like, spice it out to add more emphasis.
Yeah. Okay. I got it. What the hell was that? Dave? Hello? Dave?
Yeah, don't know. Sounds like it was a storage room. Alright, let's finish and then I'll check it out. We can take a break.
Yeah, sure. On the field where tradition is king. Come on, what the fuck, Dave? What is that? I can't see you. Are you okay?
Give me a second, Mick.
Yeah. On the field where tradition is king.
Yep, here. Not sure what that is. Can't see any damage anywhere, but damn, that was loud. Okay, let's finish this up and I'll get edited and sent off. You ready?
Always.
Okay.
On the field where tradition is king, where coaches are legends, warriors will rise. With nothing left to lose, Rick Danning has a chance to discover what it takes to be a champion. His will be tested, his dedication will be tried, and his reward will be freedom. Okay, I think that was good. Now, you should have no issues with that one. Maybe just pluck out the parts you liked from the other runs and we can just piece it together, but seems like we're done. Dave? Hello? I think we're good, Dave. Dave? Oh, for fuck's sake. David, put your headphones on. Did you go for a piss while I was sweating in here? I can't see you. Are we good? Can I go? Dave, I swear I will fucking murder you if you make me go through this one more time. Dave. Hello?
Hi.
What the who's this? Where's David?
Hi.
Who the fuck is this? I'm coming in there. Where's David?
Please come here and see what's left of your friend.
What is happening? What's wrong with David?
Your friend had a little accident and now, oops. There's a knife sticking in his eye.
The fuck?
Can you see me? I can see you. Da-di-da-di-da. Hello.
No, I can't see you. You fucking psycho, just stop this. Please tell David that this isn't funny. David! This is not funny. I need to go. I have an appointment. I've told you this.
David is not laughing. Well, I can't really tell. He may be winking. I can't tell either because my knife is in his eyeball, deep into his brain. I think it's funny, though.
How do I know you're telling the truth?
Come to the window.
No!
Please. Just come closer to the window.
Why?
I want to prove that I'm telling the truth. Okay? You ready?
Oh my fucking God! What have you done? Why?
Why? Well, let me think. No reason, really. I was walking by and I saw that the door was open. You see, I was following an old man and woman. I felt that they would be an easy slaughter, although, I felt it was a bit lazy, a bit dialed in, as some might say. No real fight, no real work involved. But I followed them all the same, feeling that today was a good day for a bit of rest, a bit of reward for a busy week, and an easy jackpot was well earned. A day to be lazy. So
Perhaps just a couple of pathetic whimpers before I cut them up, and then, well, luckily for them, I happened to come by this place. This place here! Wait, what is this place?
It's a studio!
Ah, okay. Makes sense. So this studio, well, the door was open, and I saw this nice gentleman through the crack in the door, and he was alone. I was a bit sloppy and bumped into some equipment, but I hid well because I prefer to choose my own moments, not to be forced into my art sloppily and unprepared. I wasn't ready, you see. I was still in that lazy mood and thought that perhaps this... his name again?
David! Jesus Christ! His name is David! Was David.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Ooh, my memory is absolutely atrocious. I've been on so many different medications. Probably as many as pharmacists I've killed. Okay, yes, David. Mr. David One-Eye was sitting there talking to you, and then I thought, come on, just go for it. Just go for it. A nice treat today. So, I just snuck up behind him. So exciting. I grabbed his face with my forearm and squeezed him to my chest nice and tight. And while he muffled a yell, and while he was squirming, I drove my knife into his brain. The angle was weird, so it was pushed a bit slow, but that's when it's most pleasing, I think. I felt the easiest way was through the eye, but then again, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, an artist.
You're insane!
Doesn't matter, really. Being insane or sane, it's just a matter of perspective. A matter of optics, I guess, to the world. I'm really quite normal when I'm sitting around a coffee shop or having dinner. Like when you and your daughter, Hannah, were at Costa Coffee yesterday afternoon. She dropped her unicorn doll, and I picked it up and handed it to you, and you thanked me. I was quite normal then. No?
Oh, my God.
God. Okay, whatever. But can we assume that God cares? Really? I mean, well, he hates liars. Okay, I did sort of lie when I said that I came upon the open door here. That was a lie. Sorry, Mick. Please forgive me. I had to force it open. Did cause a bit of a racket. Quite sloppy. I was following the old couple, and I was planning on chopping them up, but they were getting a bit out of the way and moving so slowly, stopping to look at shop windows. Ooh, old people. I swear, I wanted to put an axe into their heads right there on the busy street. Oh, so infuriating. And then I said, heck, leave it. I have better things to do. So, now that you know that I know you and your daughter and wife, Isabel, right? Okay, well, they have a scheduled visit next with me. Well, after I open you up, of course. So, on that matter, I really don't have a lot of time. Can we get this over with?
Why are you doing this? Please, can you just leave my family? Leave my family alone.
Sure. You have my word.
Really? Will you? I don't believe you.
Of course not. I'll probably have to go through the whole spiel of what I did to you and see how they react before I tear them up. Really the best part, if I'm being honest.
If you touch them,
then you will what? Bleed slower on me? Maybe you'll try to attack me swinging your arms I'd have cut off.
Ooh, maybe you'll refuse to look into my eyes after beheaded. No? Well, I'm at a loss. So, do you want to just open that door and stop wasting my time?
No. If you want me, you have to come and get me.
Oh, God. If I had a nickel. I swear, these Rambo moments just bore me. I swear to me. Well, Mick, you know, I can smash the glass. Maybe I can just use the keys on your friend's keychain here to open the door. Dave, right? I knew it. The old guy isn't so slow after all. Memory sharp as a tack.
Stay away from me. Please.
I'll make you a deal, Mick. How's about this? If you come out now, I will put this knife into both of your eyes. But first, I will carve my name into your chest. The deal is that if you come out and let me do this, well, put up a bit of a fight. I need some whimpers. I swear it's like heroin for me. If you do willingly come in here, I swear to you that I will leave your family alone. That'll be enough for me. Maybe I'll just go after that old couple again for a bit of post-coital excitement, as it were. What do you say? You absolutely have my word that I'll forget Hannah and Isabel.
Oh my God. Please be telling the truth. Please reconsider all of this.
Mick, come on! Big boy's pants time. You have my word. Come on.
Jesus Christ. David! David, what the fuck? Where are you, you bastard? Where are you? I hear you. I hear you coming. I'm ready for you. I got your fucking knife now, motherfucker. Come on!
What the fuck? Oh my God, the guy, he's got a knife! No!
I was 15. My family and I were in Fort Myers, Florida, and there was a terrible storm on the horizon riding in on black clouds. The waves had begun crushing like a watery bulldozer, and the sea was becoming choppy. I was boogie boarding, and I went out for one last wave. Something very cold bumped into my legs. Seconds later, I went under. In this moment, I was a boiled crab getting my leg ripped off by a hungry restaurant patron, simultaneously screaming and inhaling copious amounts of salt water. I could feel something of great strength tugging me along as the sand I clawed at began to fall away from my fingertips. Something tangible and icy was wrapped around my ankle. This is the moment that I realized, amidst the struggling, that it wasn't a riptide. Something had a hold of my leg, and it was dragging me further and further from land. When I couldn't hold my breath any longer, my fight or flight kicked in. Instead of swimming away from whatever it was, I swam along with it. My head broke above the surface one time as I projectile vomited salt and took one more deep inhale. And yet, I was dragged down again, now facing the horizon. I felt that same snug, icy grip, only now on my forearm, as it continued to pull. I'd assumed I was being pulled by a giant squid, but then I opened my eyes, and what I saw was nightmarish. I was leering directly into the eyes of a little boy with dark blue lips, a pale bluish tint to his skin, and his jaw hanging open, like the corpse of a drowning victim. His bony fingers were latched to my forearms while gazing into my soul with dead, lifeless white eyes. This boy was miraculously swimming backwards while simultaneously pulling me to my death. Utterly frightening was the vision of his legs paddling eerily sluggishly behind him while swimming in the wrong direction. I pushed my feet against his chest and shot myself away and out of his grasp. The last thing I saw was the boy reaching for my legs while receding down into the black abyss, smiling at me with a toothless grin on the way down. I shuddered when I heard a humming of what sounded like some sort of demonic lullaby after he disappeared, emanating from all around me in echoes. Once my head broke the surface, and I began taking giant breaths, my eyes adjusted, and I discovered that I was maybe only 100 yards from the shore. I swam as hard and fast as I could, but fighting exhaustion, I figured I wouldn't make it until my feet touched down on the sandbar, the waves violently crashing around me and thunder rumbling overhead. I told my parents what happened, that it was a boy, a very evil boy who pulled me under. My dad says, sometimes in a stressful situation, you'll imagine things that aren't there. He never went against his conviction that I imagined it, but I saw it in his face the next morning, pure dread in his eyes, when I showed him freezer burns on my wrists and ankles in the shape of fingers. Somehow, I believe that many of those who have drowned from undertows were really drowned by something else. They just aren't alive to tell us about it.
It wasn't the ugliest building I'd ever delivered to, but it was definitely the creepiest. It was a large block of flats in the middle of the city, borderline brutalist and a headache against the gray sky. But someone in there wanted a pizza, and I was the lucky guy who got to take it to them. The building had 12 floors, and my destination was on the 7th. It was so old and grubby that I expected I'd have to take the stairs. But to my astonishment, there was a working elevator. Smelled like a toilet, but hey, pros and cons. The lift shuddered and clanked as it climbed up, and I spent the time reading the graffiti that had been scrawled on the walls. Tags, penises, phone numbers, all the classics. Near the door, someone had scribbled, 13. Don't let him know you know. What is it, a song lyric perhaps? Not one that I knew anyway. With a ping and a shudder, the lift came to a halt, opening onto a grimy hallway. I walked quickly down to the door I was looking for. I knocked and was almost immediately faced with a wild-eyed man who looked almost relieved to see me. Munchies, I guessed. He virtually threw the money at me and then disappeared back inside, already pulling at the lid of the box. I shrugged it off and was about to return the way I had come, when suddenly the man yanked the door back open and stared at me.
"Watch out, mate,"
he said.
"We're overdue one."
His eyes boring into mine. Then he was gone for the second time. I wish I could say that he was the weirdest person I'd ever met on this job, but that wouldn't even be close to true. I chuckled to myself and moved back down the hall towards the elevator. I pressed call and waited, looking forward to getting out of there. I wasn't sure which was worse, the look of the place or the smell. At that moment, the lift doors opened and I saw the light inside was flickering eerily. Great. I stepped in, pushed ground, and leaned back against the handrail. After a moment, I realized the elevator was going up instead of down. I was annoyed, but not initially concerned. Someone on a higher floor must have called it too. It went up past 8, then 9, and 10.
11, 12. It kept going up. I blinked and looked down at the button pad. 12 floors. I swallowed and tried to calm myself. The display was probably malfunctioning. After all, what else could it be? Then, with a little shudder, the car came to a halt, and the doors slowly opened. It was dark on the other side, but I could just make out a hallway stretching away from me. The flickering elevator light spilled out, achieving little more than highlighting the shadows. As my eyes adjusted, I realized that there were no doors lining the walls, and no windows either. But the hallway was not empty. I stepped forward a little, and at the very limits of the light that stretched out from my position, I realized that I could see feet, and above them was the barely discernible outline of a man facing away from me. Blood roared in my ears, and I found that I was shaking as I stared at the silhouette. It was all wrong. The legs and arms too long, the torso too short, the head misshapen. Then he started to turn. Shock hit me hard, cold and hot at the same time. Terror, like I'd never felt before, ran through me. I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to die. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw that writing on the wall. 13. Don't let him know you know. I jerked back against the handrail, squeezing my eyes shut. My nails were cutting into my palms and I was shaking. I heard quiet footsteps moving towards me, as if softened by carpet, then louder, as if on metal, immediately in front of me. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream, but I kept silent, tried to control my breathing even as I realized I could hear someone else's. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, I heard the lift doors shut. It started to move downwards. I stayed where I was, my eyes clamped closed, still not daring to look at what might be in front of me. Another little ping indicated that I had stopped on another floor, and the doors parted. For a moment there was a silence, and then a voice said,
"You all right, mate?"
My eyes snapped open, and in front of me, standing just outside the elevator in the hallway, was my customer from the 7th floor.
"I came back out to give you your tip,"
he explained.
"I saw you was going up."
He hesitated.
"You okay?"
I shook my head. He gave me a comforting pat on the shoulder.
"Well, could have been worse, mate. You obviously did it right."
How can you live here?
I gasped. He shrugged.
"Not got much choice, really. It's not so bad once you know the rules."
He rummaged around in his pocket and handed me a couple of coins.
"For your trouble. I'd take the stairs down if I was you."
It was me, so I did. And since I did have a choice, I never went back to that building again. My name is Michael, and I'm a 14-year-old boy who lives with my aunt in the countryside. Now, out here we have no neighbors. The closest place to my house is about 8 miles away. I always loved living out here because I've always liked the seclusion, and the road we live by is always dead at night, which makes for good sleep. Now, my aunt is always working the night shift, so this means I would be home alone pretty much every night. Long story short, I came home from school on a relatively crappy day. Thunderstorms and rain all day and all night, and spent my day playing video games and Snapchatting with my friends. At about 9 o'clock, my aunt came upstairs and told me she was heading off to her job. I was always fine with this because I like being home alone. I had full range of the house and I could play loud music all I wanted. Who wouldn't love it? At about 11 o'clock, I had started feeling tired and laid down to watch some YouTube and go to sleep. And soon enough, I did. I woke up at some odd hour of the night to somebody knocking on the door. I sat up and muttered, "What the hell?" I thought my aunt had got home from the night shift, and reluctantly I went to go to answer the door and, out of habit, checked the window beside the door to make sure it was her. But there was nobody there. I thought to myself, probably some stupid kids knocking on my door and running away. And I dismissed it at that and went back into my room. I checked my phone to realize it was 3 a.m. and the thought of teenagers ding-dong ditching my home was suddenly out of question given that it was Wednesday and I basically lived in the middle of nowhere. Just as I was thinking, I heard a bang coming from the basement. I jumped up and tried to make up an excuse, like a noise of the thunderstorm to calm me down. We always kept our basement door locked anyway out of my aunt's paranoia and fear of someone breaking in. That's when I heard footsteps slowly creaking up the old wooden stairs in my basement. Frozen with fear, I grabbed my phone and called 911.
911 operator, what's your emergency?
The operator told me to go to an upstairs room in the house and grab a weapon to defend myself, but there was no way I was going to grab a knife from the kitchen, especially when I heard the door being slammed and quickly realized that someone was trying to bust it down. I jumped from my bed and closed my door quietly and hid in my closet like the 911 operator had told me to do. This was easily the scariest moment of my life, but suddenly, the banging stopped. But what comes next will haunt me for my whole life. Whoever it was screamed at the top of their lungs. But it wasn't a normal scream, it was an insane and disgruntled scream. And then I heard the basement door collapse. Now he was full out, screaming as he sprinted up the stairs. He went through all the rooms down the upstairs hallway, still screaming, until he reached mine. My door, unfortunately, didn't have a lock on it. When I heard him open my door, I was paralyzed with fear. I could see him through the shades of my closet. He was still screaming. Looking all over my room, even under my bed. But then, after trying to hold my breath for too long, I let out a puff of air. He perked up, looked straight at my closet, and slowly walked towards it, no longer screaming. I couldn't even breathe at the moment, especially when he just stopped right in front of the closet door. I could see him through the closet. He had the biggest smile I'd ever seen. As soon as he slowly reached for the closet doorknob, there was a loud bang at the door, and somebody yelling, "Police!" The man quickly ran and tried to run out of my window but failed. As soon as I saw the police tackle him, I instantly ran out of the closet and outside, now realizing that was a stupid move on my part. After a couple of minutes, I saw the police bring the man out in cuffs, but on the way to the car, he stared at me with the biggest smile and the craziest eyes I had ever seen. Watching him ride away with the police was the greatest moment of my life. But what still haunts me today is the face he made as he was standing in front of my closet door, ready to do something horrible.